Hi, and welcome. I'm Annette Oltmans, founder and CEO of the Men Project. In this workshop titled Understanding Narcissism, Exploring the Categories and Impact on Relationships, I want to help you learn to recognize traits associated with various types of narcissism, because we want to help you build a deeper understanding of the underlying factors contributing to narcissistic behaviors. There's so many different types, and some think that narcissism is only a couple of different types, and they miss a whole array of other aspects of narcissism. And so we want to do this to help you gain clarity, to help you understand how you might be impacted. We're going to learn strategies to navigate relationships that are impacted by these behaviors. And our ultimate goal is to emphasize two things: learning, education, which brings clarity so that you can overcome your confusion and your self-doubt. And then the most important thing is your healing, because we have to first understand what we're dealing with in order to work on our healing process. So we encourage you to prioritize your safety and your personal well-being, your personal self-care. So please join us in this meaningful conversation. You'll leave our time together with a clear perspective and practical tools that you can begin implementing today. So the definition of narcissism is interesting because narcissism exists on a spectrum from healthy traits to more maladaptive behaviors. Not all narcissistic tendencies indicate narcissistic personality disorder, NPD. So what is adaptive narcissism versus maladaptive narcissism? Adaptive narcissism would be healthy self-esteem, a good sense of confidence. You are comfortable advocating for yourself. You know your voice and you're not afraid to use it. And if somebody says something that minimizes you, you're still going to stand firm. This is self-love. It's the opposite of self-doubt. So you're going to be not in a situation where you're accommodating a narcissist, or where you are doing all the emotional lifting in a relationship. You are not going to be appeasing bad behavior. You're going to be taking care of yourself. And that's a healthy form of narcissism. Narcissism is on a spectrum. So what I'm talking about is over here, things that you do well for yourself, where you have a voice, where you are not afraid to use it, where you are not accommodating, things I just talked about. But then it gets over into this other side of the spectrum where this would be NPD, narcissistic personality disorder. But even moderate levels of narcissism are going to be really difficult to deal with. A healthy and adaptive narcissistic quality would also, I mentioned confidence and self-esteem. It would also be, if you have leadership qualities, you're going to be contributing positively to relationships and society. If you're leading a team, for example, you're going to create a sense of collaboration and acceptance, not that competitiveness where you're one-upping one another on your team. That would be the result of a narcissist, creating insecurities where people are competing because they are walking on eggshells and they are seeking praise from somebody who is selfish about dishing out that praise, if that makes sense. Okay, so maladaptive narcissism, would be behaviors that harm relationships, such as manipulation, a lack of empathy, a sense of entitlement, where they just believe they deserve preferential treatment. They can't listen to you well. They can't integrate your opinions or perspectives and consider your points of views. They are not really allowing you space to be heard in a conversation where there might be a conflict, for example, or if you raise a reasonable complaint, concern, or a hurt, you're not met with empathy, but more so with harsh judgment and defensiveness, where they shut you down, they overpower you, or they deflect and change the topic. They can't sit with you and in this safe container where they allow you to express what is on your mind, and then they take it in and discuss it with you. You'll also notice that they may gaslight you, rewrite history, or that conversations seem to be circular. You're going in circles, sometimes to the point you can't even remember what started the argument. But these conversations rarely, if ever, lead to solutions. You're blocked, you're stonewalled in these conversations. The world resolves around the narcissist's opinions, ideals, and self-serving desires. Okay, so that's just basically two categories. Now I'm going to break it down into different types of narcissism. And I want to credit Dr. Ramani Durvasula, and she's a great resource. She has her own channel, and you can learn even more about these traits if you go to, if you search her on the internet. She has a lot of material and she has books. So I want to give her credit. But before I get into specific types, I want to briefly refer to a tool that we use to help you identify narcissism. Because I mentioned before, some narcissists are aggressive and some are passive aggressive and covert. But what all narcissists seem to display is what we call the pillars of abuse. And if you think of a pillar, it's what holds up something. And so pillars of abuse are the foundational factors that you can identify that show you that you are in a narcissistic relationship. I tend to like this tool more than getting bogged down with the types of narcissism because it's really self-explanatory. But the more education you have, the more you're able to understand your situation, the better off you will be. So that's why we're going to talk about types today. But first, the pillars of abuse. The first one is entitlement, where the perpetrator believes that they deserve preferential treatment, or they put you in a downgraded position, or there's double standards. Rules that apply to you don't apply to them. In other words, you have to obey certain protocols in your familial relationship, and they are above having to do that. They're exempt. The next one I want to talk about is a faulty belief system. So this is the second pillar, a faulty belief system. Now, what might that be? Things like entrenched beliefs about patriarchy, a lot of religious beliefs that place women in a downgraded position would be a faulty belief system. Now, even benevolent forms of patriarchy can teeter ever so close to abuse because they believe they're in a hierarchical position than a female. This is a male-female belief system, or I'm saying a gender inequality belief system. The next pillar is image management. The perpetrator cares a lot about how they are perceived by others. And so they will do things like make comments to the children, maybe over years, that are undermining your credibility. It might not be done in front of you. It's most likely done behind the scenes, but it's just ways to taint other people's view of you, your children, your social circle. Maybe it's at your place where your religious community, your work environment, where the person is undermining you. That is to lift themselves up, to make themselves look better than they are. And then when you finally have the courage to speak up and say, I'm being mistreated, other people already have developed an opinion of you based on how you've been undermined by this person who's so focused on their image management. And then the last pillar of abuse I want to talk about is a low emotional IQ, where they just have not been, probably in their upbringing, and it even can happen later in life based on their social circles or their religious circles or their ethnic background and traditions. They don't have a healthy command of their own emotions. They don't understand their own emotions. They might tap into one or two emotions like anger or maybe sadness, but it's mostly anger and judgment. It's not healthy emotions. Like, there's so many emotions: worry, a doubt, fear, joy, so many emotions that they don't tap into because they have a lower emotional IQ. And it makes it very difficult for somebody like that to change because they don't have the concepts, that they didn't grow up supported in their emotions. And so they're dealing with a very limited IQ in that area. Okay, so that's our pillars of abuse. Now I want to talk about the first type of narcissistic behavior, and that's grandiose narcissism. These traits would be things like arrogance, entitlement, charm, superficiality. They seek admiration. They lack empathy. Now, they might show empathy towards others, but in their interpersonal relationship, they don't express empathy, not sincere empathy. They may display rage when they're disappointed or confronted. Their level of image management is off the charts. They may be successful and in leadership, or they may be the person who seeks praise to the point that they underperform by a lack of follow through because they've moved on to the next big deal. You know, these types of personalities that are always bragging about what deal what's going on in their life, or if it's in the workplace, what next big deal they're working on. And a lot of times these are distorted. They're not based in accurate information. It's somebody who's exaggerating and bragging. I like to use a phrase, it doesn't mean that they're always successful. Many narcissists are very successful, but it could also be the person that's, big hat, no cattle, always bragging about something, but they have little to show for it. So that would be the grandiose narcissist. The next category is the covert, vulnerable narcissist. Now, these traits would be hypersensitivity. So just about anything you say that isn't complimentary is going to be faced with this vigorous defensiveness. It's because of such deep-rooted insecurity. Even though they don't come across as insecure, that's what the underlying cause is. They're passive-aggressive. They might say, oh, sure, yes, I agree to this, but then they do the opposite to retaliate against you because they don't believe they should have to conform to anybody other than to themselves. Rather than openly admitting their motives, they're manipulative and they're covert. So they use a lot of the behaviors that we have on our resource page that we call the terms and definitions, where we define different covert emotionally abusive behaviors. And I highly recommend that you get that sheet because there's like 33, 4 or so behaviors. For example, blame shifting, false accusations, minimizing you, dismissing your concerns, gaslighting. There's so many behaviors that we define for you that'll really help you say, oh my gosh, my person does these things. And it really will help validate you and help you understand what you're dealing with. And then the next step is you can start to prepare how to respond. But that is the covert, vulnerable narcissist. They have high expectations about how you should behave while they expect little from themselves. They may agree with you, but resent you, like I mentioned in a different way. They'll counter you, they'll undermine you, but it will all be secretive. The next category I want to talk about is the malignant narcissist. The traits are where they combine narcissistic tendencies with exploitative, antagonistic, and sometimes psychopathic behaviors. You are nothing more than a tool to use for their personal gain. If you're in an intimate relationship, you're merely an extension of them. So you aren't your own individual person. You don't have autonomy. You are there to meet their needs and desires. And if you step left when they expected you to step right or vice versa, they're upset because you didn't meet their expectation. They are manipulative. They lack remorse and can be aggressive or even paranoid. So you'll see this jealousy that's really unhealthy. You might see where they want to control how you spend your time and your resources. It could be that they don't want you to talk to your family members or limit the time that you can or judge the time that you do. It could be financial abuse and so many other forms of abuse. They have to win every argument. It's not about two people coming together and working through a problem. They're more concerned with winning, powering over you, and having the last word. They want to be admired. If you were in couples counseling with someone and the counselor asked them, well, what is it that you really want out of a relationship? They might say something like admiration or adoration. They honestly believe and expect that you should have this high regard for them, regardless of how they behave or what they say or what they do. So their level of entitlement is off the charts. The next category is what we call a communal narcissist. And these traits are this altruistic and community focused. So a communal narcissist might seek validation through selfless acts and moral superiority. They might volunteer in the community, doing things that other people will see. And so their image management, remember I mentioned the pillar image management, they do things that will cause other people to view them as a really great person. They might volunteer at church or at the synagogue. They might take on extra roles at your child's school, even though they're very different behind closed doors. It's wonderful for all of us to be involved in the community and to volunteer our time, but they do it with an ulterior motive to get others to think highly of them and to not see what they truly are behind closed doors. Then we have the next category, is the benign narcissist. So these traits would be more mild narcissistic behaviors that are not necessarily as harmful. And I don't mean to minimize the benign narcissist, because every type of narcissism creates abusive results, but they might be self-absorbed, for example. Being self-absorbed can be really harmful for someone. They might not be attacking you. They might be always putting the attention on themselves, which let's consider a parent and a child. A child whose parent is always self-absorbed isn't available to emotionally meet the needs of the child. It's always about them. So it might not seem like there's a significant negative impact, but over time, it's turns into childhood neglect. So if a parent is a benign narcissist, they neglect the emotional needs of the child due to how everything is prioritized to serve the narcissistic person's needs and wants. That's the priority. They might be hyper-focused on how many likes they get in social media and so forth. The next category is a neglectful narcissist. These traits are indifference towards others, or indifference towards your needs or your emotions. Now, indifference or apathy it's a form of neglect, and it's really harmful when you're in a relationship with that person. They don't care enough to assert themselves and to be curious about your concerns. Tell me more, honey. I want to understand where you're coming from. You're not going to get that. They're going to be indifferent towards you. Like, yeah, whatever, sarcasm and a lack of concern. There's other neglectful forms of narcissists. You might notice, I've actually had this question brought to me a number of times where we talk about the financially controlling person. In this category, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the person who is lazy. Maybe there was one case where the husband is an MD and he didn't want to work. So he didn't. He felt entitled to just stay home and be lazy. He wouldn't even open the mail or worry about the bills. The wife in the relationship, who had a much lower earning capacity, had to go work full time. She was still caring for the kids, getting them to and from school, while the husband was just basically mooching off the other person, even though they had the education and the ability to work. So it's neglectful of all sorts of things. It could be neglectful towards animals, where they just don't care about how that your dog is fed on time or any of those tasks or what the kids need. It's just it's a selfish laziness and neglect, which is really harmful because it means that they're not doing any emotional or physical lifting in the relationship. They're dependent on everybody else to do the work. Then we have the entitled, self-righteous narcissist. And the traits would be a strong sense of entitlement and moral superiority. So you might see this person in a religious situation where they understand the scriptures or the texts, and they use those texts to manipulate and power over you because their moral judgment is considered supreme to your moral judgment. So you're in a downgraded position. You're perceived as being less qualified. It's self-appointed leadership they give themselves. That's how you would notice it. They judge your emotions. They judge your opinions harshly. They may criticize you and just really dismiss your opinions because they're better than you. They know better than you. They become indignant when their needs are not met. And you'll see this a lot in religious circles, like I said, where they will use this to power over you. Or it could also be in certain ethnic cultures where there's longstanding old traditions that feed into certain roles, and they aren't flexible with their roles. They take advantage and self-appoint them in the highest role possible in that ethnic tradition. The next would be generational or cultural narcissism. Pardon me. And these traits are influenced by cultural or generational factors. So I touched on that briefly just now when I'm talking about entitled or self-righteous narcissism. It bleeds into generational or cultural narcissism, where they're influenced by their culture or these generational factors. They display attitudes and actions that reflect societal norms, valuing individualism and self-promotion. They're not collaborative. They don't reciprocate. They take from the relationship. They always place themselves in that position of admiration and influence, whether they have the IQ to carry it off or not. It's entitlement. It's an expectation. Let's see, I'm just going to look at my note here for a second. I'm going to give you an example. In certain Latinx cultures, for example, and I don't mean to pick on that one culture because there's variations of this in multiple cultures, but let's say both the husband and the wife work full time. You will see that the wife is then still expected to take care of the kids, cook dinner, clean up dinner, give them their baths, get them to bed, while the other party watches a football game and doesn't contribute. Their day of work is all they're willing to do. They have this expectation that it's not their role. Now, I know I'm talking about male perpetrators and women victims, but it can be flipped the other way around. It just depends on the culture. It depends on the way they create their family culture, the microculture, but it's this embedded belief system where one person takes advantage of the other person because that's how they are determining their society to be. Okay, so now I want to shift into talking about the root causes and underlying factors. There's early life influences. So the impact of childhood experiences, such as unmet emotional needs. So a child may grow up to be a narcissist because their emotional needs are never, and their emotional intellect is never developed. It's not, their needs aren't met. They're not, their parents are not emotionally available to really help the child process what they're feeling and to gain a command over emotional intelligence. They're neglected. Or in other cases, the child is overindulged. They never face consequences. Their parents are always rescuing them and minimizing the consequences. They go to the school when they've behaved badly and they want the consequences to be removed. That kind of repetitive behavior can create a narcissist where they just believe they're entitled to preferential treatment. So that is one form of, or these are two forms of ways that a narcissist would develop. Another would be based on their trauma and attachment styles, how past trauma has shaped coping mechanisms, or more so a lack of coping mechanisms, and contribute to narcissistic tendencies. They aren't taught how to cope properly with conflict. And so they develop into this lower emotional IQ where they tap in on the 4 pillars of abuse: entitlement, a faulty belief system, image management, and a lower emotional IQ. Trauma is important to be nurtured and to help the child overcome that trauma. And if that isn't happening, particularly if there's recurring trauma, they may have a narcissistic parent and they learn that behavior and they just repeat it. If they're not experiencing emotional fulfillment, then they're going to be neglected, which can lead to narcissism. Or when I talked about overindulgence, I want to talk also about when a child is idealized. And I was guilty of this for a few years with my son. He was such an amiable child that got good grades, good athlete, blah, 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 that I had expectations of him to always perform well. So I was idealizing him. It was constantly praising and placing an expectation on him to outperform his last accomplishment. And that can have a real negative impact on the child. Now, thank goodness I figured this out and was able to intervene on my own behavior, but that can lead to creating a narcissist when everyone is looking up to that golden child and treating them like they're something special. So they're just rarely required to, well, it's two things. They're rarely required to face consequences because it's almost like disbelief that they do anything wrong, but they're also placed in a bubble like they're special. And so they start to believe that they are. And that's really not at all healthy, a healthy way to raise a child. Societal and cultural factors. So the role of societal norms that reward certain narcissistic behaviors is what I'm talking about. So for example, we're each part of a microculture, and I touched on this briefly. Our friends and our family belief systems drive how we view ourselves and the world around us. We develop a belief system. We all have biases. You know, you might have a bias that's very different from my bias, but we all have biases based on our belief system. I like to use an example of politics. If you are a left-leaning Democrat and someone says you have to become a right-leaning Republican or vice versa, there's a lot that has to go on for you to change your entire worldview. And this is how some cultures are. They're so embedded and fixed that, you know, boundaries are meant to be flexible. We're meant to be open-minded and grow and learn constantly. But some are so entrenched that they never change their opinion. Like from 8th grade on, they still have the same opinions about roles that people are expected to play, prejudices, all kinds of things can play into biases and these cultural factors that will breed a narcissistic outcome. If you grew up in a strict patriarchal family, women will be placed in a downgraded position where their voice carries lesser influence, or where they were, the male population in the family is just like sending the boy to college, but not spending money to send the girl to college. That's actually an exaggerated example. It can be much more subtle than that. But when there's preferential treatment given to one race over another, or one gender over another, then you're going to see the negative outcome. You want to have a trauma-informed understanding. You want to look beyond behaviors in children to recognize deeper emotional wounds. That's what your motivation would want to be. You want to look deeper into what is triggering them and meet them where they are emotionally, rather than distance yourself and expect them to accommodate or service their own wounds. That would, by neglecting them in that way, it can potentially lead to narcissism. Okay, now recognizing traits in relationships is what I want to talk about. Key patterns in behavior. We have manipulation, we have entitlement, and a strong need for admiration. We touched on that. We have difficulty accepting responsibility or feedback, and I want to touch on this a little longer. So when you raise a reasonable complaint, concern, or if you've been hurt and you raise that point, you'll notice that narcissists in general don't take responsibility for their part. They will be defensive. They will shut you down. They will interrupt you, or they'll change the topic. That's called deflection. And so this conversation that you hope to have doesn't move through to solutions because they aren't accepting responsibility. And you're willing to accept responsibility, so much so that you start to doubt yourself and wonder, am I responsible for this? Or maybe I didn't hear things correctly. Maybe I'm wrong about this. You start to doubt yourself based on their reactions, even though their reactions are the ones that are significantly distorted. And so you're going to see this entrenched pattern of a lack of accepting responsibility. They will say and do just about anything to avoid responsibility, or they might be more covert and partially apologize. They'll say, I'm sorry for one thing, but they don't really fully take responsibility. So let's say they do something that really hurts you. They might say, oh yeah, I can see how that, I'm sorry about that. I was, I had a bad moment. But let's say it was something more profound and they publicly humiliated you or something, and you're really hurt by that, or they said something to you that was really critical and hurtful. They don't take full ownership. They just kind of half apologize, which confuses you. And you then think, well, they apologized, so maybe they won't do it again, but they're not really fully owning it, because a true apology would be to stop the behavior. It would be to make reparations commensurate to the harm caused to you. So if they had slandered you, they would have to go back and correct, if you wanted them to go back and correct that, and to uplift you. It has reparations commensurate with the harm done. They step into that role. They assert themselves and fix it. That's what true responsibility looks like. But you're rarely going to see anything, if ever, close to that from a narcissist. Okay. The impact on your emotional well-being is what I want to talk about just for a second. You might not realize that you're with a narcissist. And it's so many people's experience. It was my experience. For years, we went to therapists. I was reading everything I could, marriage books, marriage enrichment programs, marriage intensives. And so many counselors are not trained in narcissistic behaviors, so they don't recognize them when they play out in a therapeutic session. And so it was missed. And I was so confused. And I was so willing to admit fault. I was so willing to accommodate. I would have done anything to help our relationship. And so I was taking on more responsibility than what was mine. And that's a very common trait that victims, survivors carry, because they tend to be empathic in nature. So they take on more responsibility. You're going to see that, how do I say this? That your well-being is being compromised because you're over functioning. You're doing the lion's share of the work, and they're barely lifting a finger when it comes right down to it. They do all this destruction, and then they just partially apologize. And then you're expected to forgive, or you're the bad guy because you're being too critical. Everything is turned around and the responsibility is laid at your feet. And if you don't recognize that, it's going to have a strong emotional impact on your well-being, emotional and physical, because the prolonged stress of being in a situation like that starts to deplete your body. Your immune system begins to be compromised. My immune system completely collapsed, and I developed all kinds of autoimmune illnesses that were really troublesome, that I had to be on prescription medications. And I'm not just talking about, I didn't feel well. I had physical illnesses. I had medical issues. And then once that chapter in my life was behind me, miraculously, those physical ailments disappear. And so it's really important to identify how this is impacting you, because you've been coming from a place of minimizing the impact on yourself while you're self-reflecting on what you can do to make things better, but you're not looking at how you're really being harmed. And so it's important to not have that level of cognitive dissonance that I mentioned before, where you don't have an accurate view. You need to have an accurate view of your situation so that you can step into self-care. It's so important that you care well for yourself, because this other person is not caring for you. In a healthy relationship, both people are caring for each other and they're caring for themselves. But in a narcissistic relationship, there's two people taking care of the narcissist, and no one is taking care of the victim survivor. Okay. the other thing, it's in terms of your impact on your emotional well-being, is understanding your reactions and your subconscious triggers. When you have recurring trauma over and over again, these arguments are traumatic, no matter how subtle, covert, or overt and raging they are. No matter the differences of all these traits of narcissistic categories, it's going to have a negative effect on you. You might find yourself being reactionary rather than responding. They say something that they've said 1,000 times before that is not true, and you know it's not, and you blurt out a hostile reaction, or you throw something, or you do something out of character for yourself because you're having a trauma response. And it's so important to recognize, and we have a workshop called reactive abuse. And I hope that you'll go and watch that if you find that you are taking on a persona that you don't recognize in yourself anymore, that you're not your best self, that this person is bringing out the worst qualities in you. It would be good to watch this video, because it's going to really highlight how it's involuntary reactions. It's not conscious. You're in a fight, flight, freeze, or appease mode where you're not thinking first. It's just a reaction that's happening. It's a trauma response. And trauma responses mean that you're likely developing post-traumatic stress disorder, which is very common in narcissistic relationships. So we have another workshop that talks about PTSD versus complex PTSD. And I hope you'll listen to that too, because it'll help you define maybe what your symptoms are. So now I just want to talk briefly about navigating relationships. We're coming short on time, so I need to move fast. You want to set and maintain boundaries. And there's strategies for creating healthy boundaries to protect your well-being. Boundaries are meant to be somewhat flexible, but when you're with a narcissist, you're going to find yourself having to set a firm boundary and then following it up with consequences when they don't comply, because it's the only way they will learn that they can't constantly take advantage of you, minimize you, belittle you, mistreat you, is that you set a boundary. An example of a boundary, and I always encourage people to take baby steps. Don't set a boundary that you can't follow through with the consequence if you're not courageous enough or you're not strong enough to do that yet. But it might be that you just say, I'm not going to have this conversation with you when you act like that. And you exit the room and you give it 30 minutes or an hour before you try to come back or before you're willing to engage again. And it's being emotionally distant, not relying on them to meet your emotional needs. They're not going to meet your emotional needs. So it's pulling away. It's maybe not being available to that person sexually. Maybe you move into a different bedroom. It's hard to be vulnerable in intimacy when you have somebody who is mistreating you. It's hard to feel safe. And so it's respecting your self-worth and setting some boundaries. And we have talks that we've done on boundary setting. So I'm not trying to impose upon you that it's your responsibility to set these boundaries. They're boundary crashers. It's hard work to set boundaries with a narcissist, but when you get stronger, you can do it easily. And so it's something that I would love for you to spend some time learning about. And we have a course that I want to emphasize. It's our self-paced course. And it's comprehensive. It's only 4 modules. But if you take this course, you will have a comprehensive education of your circumstances. And you will feel much more stronger, much more validated and equipped to deal with the nuances in your personal case. So I really encourage you to take this course. So many graduates report that it changed their lives, that it opened their eyes in ways that would have taken years in therapy to get there. So it'll jumpstart you on your healing process. I want to emphasize to focus on self-care. If you're in a hostile situation like this, make sure that you take time. You might be isolating because you're depressed. or you have anxiety and you have shame, like you can't share the truth about your relationship with your closest friends and family, I want you to stretch yourself and be physically active. Find safe people to confide in, people that are really in your corner that won't judge you. Maybe it's a therapist, maybe it's a support group. You can join our coaching calls that we're just opening up to the public, where once a month we all come into a forum. We don't reveal any faces or names, and you can ask your questions. You can raise situations that you don't quite know how to respond to, and we'll answer that, and you'll receive community support. I really encourage you to be part of a supportive community, whether that's through friends, whether it's going to exercise class and having new friendships, whatever it takes, but to stretch yourself, because these things produce endorphins where otherwise you have cortisol and adrenaline pumping through your system that is making you sick, making you traumatized and stressed. And so it's so important to do things for self-care to deposit into your life. You're having all these withdrawals. It's up to you to find ways to get deposits into your life. I'll close out today and say, please focus on taking really good care of yourself, educating yourself, working on you, working on loving yourself, getting stronger, not so much on trying to fix the other person, but really caring well for yourself. And so until next month's workshop or until the coaching call, I'll see you next time. Take really good care. Bye-bye.